It is so great to be here with you and to speak about these things that are very related to your life and to our life as Christians as well. And to get us into what I want to talk about with these three great commandments in investing, I like to think about goats. And what I mean by that is not the biblical kind you might think of, the animal, but instead that in every area of human interest, we always ask the question of what is the greatest of all time? So in music, is it the Beatles? Is it Metallica? Is it Taylor Swift? All some of my favorites. In basketball, of course, is it Jordan or LeBron? In retail, is it Sam's Club or Costco? Just kidding. Definitely Costco. No doubt in my mind at all. In theology, is it Augustine or Aquinas or Calvin or Luther or Wesley? These are the kind of questions we humans ask. What are the greatest? What are the greatest ideas? Who are the greatest people? What are the greatest events? And we see lots of goats in the Bible as well, not just of the non-sheep and scapish version. But what I mean by that is when we think about all the things that God says in the Bible, and he says a lot of things, we can ask the question of which of these are the greatest things he says? Not that the others aren't important, but that is which things that God says, which of them are of the utmost importance? And I can think of a lot of ideas and teachings, instructions, great moments in the Bible that I think could be given this kind of goat category. I think, for example, of God's instructions to Adam and Eve in Genesis 1 and 2 about what it means to be human and what human responsibility is. I think about Jesus' answer when he's asked near the end of his life how to interpret the whole Bible, that last week in Jerusalem. I think also of Jesus' final instructions that he gives at the end of the Gospel of Matthew about what our mission in the world is. And in our different theological and church traditions, even represented here today, we have various names for these great moments, for these great instructions. We often call them the cultural mandate, the greatest commandment, and the Great Commission. And I think those are good names to describe, these great moments. I think it might also be helpful. I like to think of these as three greats, three greatest of all times, and to maybe call them the Great Cultivation, the Great Commandment, and then the Great Commission. Now, I have 6 adult kids, and we have a lot of fun together. And over the years, various times, younger and now even, my kids will debate who's the goat of the goats? Who's the greatest of something? That is, so for example, if Thor battled Superman, who would win, for example? Or, I love this one, if we took all 47 U.S. presidents and they ran an election against each other, or ran a 100-yard dash against each other, who would win, right? But I think when we turn to the Bible, I think it's good to ask, we can identify these great moments, but then to ask even a further question, if these were in some kind of biblical competition, which one would win? Which of these do you think is the most important? That is, which of these, according to the scriptures, is the weightiest? And I don't know if you've ever considered Jesus' words from Matthew 23:23, where he actually says that there are some things that are weightier in the law than other things. So while all that God has said is important and inerrant and inspired, some things are weightier than others. So of these big three moments, which of these might be the most? And I actually want to do a little show of hands here. Okay, in your tradition, your understanding, if you had to choose one of these as the most important, who would choose the Great Cultivation? Genesis 1:27-28. Curious. Okay. Who would choose the Great Commandment, love God and love neighbor? Okay. And who would choose the Great Commission, Jesus' commission? Okay. It's very interesting. I did the same thing 2 weeks ago in Raleigh with the group. And interestingly, the results were kind of similar to that. That's very interesting. Now, if there is some inevitable competition between these goats, though, how do we understand which of them are the most important? And I think different traditions have answered this somewhat differently. And the reason you answered the way you did is probably because of your pastor or some other theologian or some other aspect of your church tradition. But different traditions have tended to emphasize one of these over the other. Now, others might, different traditions might say the Great Commission is the most important. I think that's pretty common. I was kind of actually surprised that wasn't your primary notion. But different traditions have emphasized different aspects. Now, what I would suggest that as you and I think about these three goat moments in the Bible, that all three of these are actually of a piece, that they are organically connected, and that these are meant to be taken together as the ongoing work, really at the core of what it means to be Christians in the world, in every area of what we do, rather than seeing the Great Cultivation or the Great Commandment or the Great Commission as somehow in competition with each other. I'd like to suggest to you that all three of these mutually inform each other, and they are the work of God's call upon us as Christian humans in the world. And I'm suggesting that in a fundamental way, we should see the cultural mandate, the greatest commandment, and the Great Commission as one thing, really three sides of one triangle that together these great commandments are essential to the Christian faith and life. And so what I want to do in this time that we're together here this morning for a number of minutes is I want to give a brief overview of all three of these great moments, and just to make sure we understand what the scriptures say about each of them. And then I want to ask at the end, how might this apply to our lives as investors and those who are running companies and those who are guiding people to invest funds as well? So that's what I want to do. It's pretty simple. I want to talk about each of these three and then turn at the end and ask, what in the world would this have to do with investing? So here's the first one. We'll start with the Great Commission. And again, of the three GOAT moments, I would have guessed that more of you would have raised your hands for this, because in the evangelical tradition, this has been, especially for the last couple hundred years, very dominant. The missions movement, the emphasis on fulfilling the Great Commission and in local churches as well as beyond. And of course, that's not bad, because this goes back to Jesus' own teachings at the very end of the first gospel in Matthew 28, verses 16 to 20. Very common. After all, who hasn't heard a missionary who's home on furlough preach that text as their text? It's like the one they all choose because it's this great text about going into all the world. And from the earliest days of the church, the Gospel of Matthew was really the dominant gospel. For the first few hundred years, Matthew's kind of vision, the reason it's printed as the first book in the New Testament is because it was such an influential understanding of who Jesus is. That includes the Lord's Prayer and the Sermon on the Mount and the Caesarea Philippi confession of you are the Christ. All the things that come from Matthew are liturgical form of praying the Lord's Prayer. That's Matthew's version, etc. And so it's very, very important. And when you read the Gospel of Matthew, you see tons of crucial ideas coming from it, including this very, very last set of verses where Jesus tells them to go into all the world. As you see, the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where he had told them. They saw him, they worshiped him, some doubted or were hesitant. Then they came to him and he said, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I'm with you to the end of the age. So this is a familiar text. What's going on here? Well, for time's sake, I can't say all the things, but let me just point out a few key ideas. They've returned to Galilee, where Jesus had spent in the north most of his ministry, where he was well received. They returned to there, and Galilee represents the Gentiles. It's going to all the nations. And we also get this clarification of the titles that were in the very first verse of the New Testament, where Jesus is described as the son of David and the son of Abraham. And particularly this idea that Jesus is the true king, the one who has authority, and that is the son of Abraham. That really represents this fundamental Christian idea that has affected most of us in this room, unless you're of Jewish descent, and that is that the gospel goes forth to all nations. That Abraham was called way back in Genesis to bless all nations, and now Jesus, as the true and final son of Abraham in that sense, is blessing all nations as well. And we also see in these verses some major themes in Matthew, that they bow down and worship him, which is this crucial understanding of Christianity, that Jesus is worthy of worship in the same way that God the Father is, that Jesus has authority, that heaven and earth are now being reunited in him, that again, disciple making of people of all nations, that God is with us. Jesus is with us. He is Emmanuel. And we see lots of things from the Old Testament coming back in here. Daniel chapter 7 and the Son of Man's authority, heaven and earth from Genesis, Cyrus's decree at the end of the Old Testament to go into all the world, etc. So in other words, the Great Commission is clearly a goat passage. It definitely deserves to be in this pantheon of greatest of all time. And before we move on to our next goat, I do just want to say something very briefly about this language that's underlined there of make disciples of all nations, because this is going to come back at the end as we think about how this applies to investing, in that it's so crucial to understand that the message of Christianity is not to just go and get people saved from their sins. That's absolutely true. But the message of Christianity, the call of Jesus on our lives, is to go and make disciples, to actually shape by the power of the Spirit, through the forgiveness of sins and through the ongoing work of the Spirit, to actually shape people to learn to inhabit the world in the ways that accord with God's kingdom. That's so crucial. All right. And so this is our first goat. Let's turn to the second goat here, the Great Commandment. Now, near the end of Jesus' public ministry, so right shortly before the Great Commission here, but while he's still ministering, he journeys to Jerusalem. And the last week of Jesus' life, he spends there, and the religious leaders are very upset with him because he is not of their class, he's not of their training, and has massive followers who are not listening to them as much. They're also worried that the Romans are going to come in and crush this revolutionary, and that's who he is perceived to be. So they decide we need to discredit him publicly and put an end to him. And so they gather together, the religious leaders in Jerusalem do, and they approach him with a series of questions in public, very spicy, that are meant to discredit him and therefore show all the followers of him that they are wrong. And so the first question they ask him, they've got him. Totally. It's the question of, should you pay taxes to Caesar? And I'm sure at this conference over the years, maybe this year even, this is one of the many texts that comes up because it's got a coin in it. So we got to talk about it at Kingdom Advisors, right? So it's got something to do with money, and it certainly does. But of course, there's something deeper going on here. And that is that they are trying to entrap Jesus to show all his would-be followers that he is not worth following, because you see, he's in this horrible dilemma. Because if he says, yes, you should pay taxes to Caesar, they could say to all their fellow Jews, see, he's a sellout to the Roman Empire. But if he says, no, you should not, then they can say they can kind of step aside and say, see, Romans, he's not obeying your laws. And so there's no way out of this for Jesus. Like, he is completely trapped. This is like this chef's kiss moment for the religious leaders, right? Until Jesus answers. And he says, render to Caesar what's Caesar, and render to God's what's God's. Now, we could talk about that text for many hours yet today, but that becomes this fundamental text in the entire 2,000-year Christian history of how to think about our engagement with culture. And it's nuanced. We have to say a lot of things, but it's a very, very important text, not only about money, but really about how we relate to culture. So that one doesn't work. So the second question, they come and they ask him, and you can find this in Matthew 21 and 22 or other places. They ask about a woman who marries multiple brothers who are all to die, and whose wife will she be in the resurrection age. This is purely a trap. They're just trying to give him this super theological question that there's no way, there's no good answer to it. And he gives them this great answer as well. God's the God of the living, not of the dead. And so finally, the religious leaders regroup, and they come to him with the only question of theirs it's still not sincere, but it's the most legitimate question. And that is this question of, what is the greatest commandment? And I don't know what exactly they were thinking he might answer, but I think they were probably imagining that as a non-trained rabbi, that is, he's not a trained rabbi, that he probably would stumble with that. Because what if I just handed you the whole Bible, and said, okay, I want you to right now turn to one verse and tell me what's the most important verse in there? That would be hard to do, right? And we even have a lot of help from what Jesus says to get at that. But imagine if they're basically saying to him, of all the scriptures, and again, he's not educated like they are, that he wasn't trained as a rabbi, he's trained as a carpenter. And they just say, tell us what's the greatest commandment. I mean, they think there's no way he's going to come up with a good answer. But he does. He gives them the Shema, that is, That is, that you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And that's actually a really good answer. I mean, that's one that any, I think, faithful Jewish leader or person would say, okay, that's actually a pretty good answer. But Jesus doesn't stop there. He then says, and there's actually a second commandment that's like it, that you shall also love your neighbor as yourself. And that combination, then he goes on to say, and it's on these two laws that the whole of God's instructions hang. So this becomes this fundamental way in which Christians now for 2,000 years have had a way to organize the Bible. And again, when I asked for a show of hands, most of you said that, and that's good. It's a good goat answer. I mean, after all, it's Jesus saying, what is the first greatest commandment of the whole Bible? And what's the second? In other words, those are not the only things God says, but they become this frame by which we can evaluate anything else we read in the Bible, and we can evaluate our lives as well. Is this leading to a love for God and a love for neighbor? And we also need to be aware that it's very easy in different traditions to unintentionally or intentionally put those into competition with each other. Some of our traditions are really good about loving God, and then we're not really sure what to do about loving neighbor. Some traditions really emphasize love neighbor, and they kind of lose a connection with God. So we have to be aware, because Jesus keeps these things together and says they're crucial. So this is a very good goat moment as well, and a very important one that I think is going to affect these things. So, because again, as I say here, the potentiality of practicing divine devotion in a way that neglects or even eschews devotion to fellow creatures made in God's image, the family of humanity together under the Father, love for God that does not include love for others is not whole. It's not singular. It's incomplete and adulterated. So this is very, very important for the Christian tradition to keep together both love for God and love for others. And this leads us then to the third of our goats, what we could call the great cultivation or the cultural mandate. Every religion, every philosophy of life has what we call in philosophy a metaphysic. That is your fancy Wednesday or Thursday morning word here, an understanding of what the world is and how it functions. And every religion, every philosophy needs to have an understanding of this. You actually have a metaphysic. You may not have thought about it. It may not be consistent and coherent and cohesive, but we all have some kind of understanding of these things. And a lot of times in philosophical and religious discussion, we kind of break down an understanding of a metaphysic into these categories. That is, how did the world come to be? That's really, really important. How do you think the world came to be? What we call a cosmogony. How is the world structured? Like, how do things work in the world? That's what we call a cosmology. What does it mean to be human? Such an important issue for every religion and philosophy. We call anthropology. And also, why do we as humans experience death? And why do we experience brokenness? And why do we experience so much grief and sadness? There's what went wrong. Every philosophy and religion has to answer this. This is the technical term for this would be a hamartiology, like what went wrong. And then also, what's the end game? Like, why does this all matter? That's what we call an eschatology. Now, in my years of study and particularly thinking about the Bible philosophically like this, I've really come to believe that you will be hard-pressed to find any metaphysic in the ancient world or in the modern world that is as comprehensive and nuanced and beautiful and satisfying on all of these answers as the Judeo-Christian heritage, and particularly the Christian heritage. A big part of my own academic work and pastoral work is helping us understand that the Bible is a religion, but it's more than that. It's actually a vision for all of life. And when you think about these categories from the Bible, and again, we don't have time to go super in detail to them, but does the Bible have a cosmogony? Does it have a vision for how the world came to be? Absolutely. The answer is that all that exists, all that you and I see, all that you put into your body today, this wonderful food and all that you're experiencing, all that God has made, all that is, he has made, and that the rest of the Bible explains that this is actually all made and held together through Jesus. This is the claim of Christianity. How is the world structured? Well, all things he made are, here's your Hebrew word for the day that I want you to get, tov, T-O-V. This is this wonderful Hebrew word that we usually translate as good, which is fine, but it actually is this kind of combination of good and beautiful together. It's both morally good and also aesthetically beautiful. And the number one word that keeps being repeated in the creation account is that everything that God has made is tov. It's good, beautiful, all these things together. This is this fundamental cosmogony and cosmology in all the diversity and distinction and connection of the world. Everything is tov. And that includes the anthropology of the Old Testament and the New Testament as well. Unique among all of God's creatures, zebras and aardvarks and bamboo trees and all the things that he has made, unique is the human. Because the human alone is made in the image of God. The human alone is made of the dust of the earth with God's own breath breathed into it and his own image stamped on it. And the thing that it says, the scriptures say in Genesis 1, everything is tov, 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 tov. And then when he creates humanity, he says, meod tov. It's very good. This is the height of his creation. That's very different than other ancient Near Eastern religions, which would see humans as slaves to the kings, which is very convenient if you're a king and writing these things, right? But in the Judeo-Christian heritage, humans are actually the image bearers of God. But even as Tov, Adam and Eve are not complete, right? They have been given, Adam's not complete by himself. He needs Eve. And then together they've been given work. They've been given something to do, and they've been given, even before the fall, something to cultivate and take care of. And then they are also meant to mature into a wholeness. There's things they don't know even. They don't know the difference between good and evil, and they have not eaten of the tree of eternal life. And the Bible explains then that Jesus Christ is the second Adam who is completely Tov, and who reboots this, because the hamartiology is that something went wrong. And that what happened was that evil entered the world not as a separate entity, but as a distortion of the good. And the Tov humans in the Tov world encounter a creature who leads them to love and worship wrongly. And that disordering of love then results in a broken relationship between God and a relationship between humans and each other and humans and the world we live in. And so all of the death and brokenness enters the world. And this is this fundamental understanding. And then what's the end game? Well, God graciously does not kill and destroy, but instead makes a plan for a future time when the Genesis 1 and 2 reality will be restored. And if you read to the end of the Bible, you'll see in the book of Revelation, this is exactly how it's described, that the vision and the reality of Adam and Eve's experience in Genesis 1 and 2 is now culminated through the second Adam. And in many ways, many Christian traditions would say, and through the gathering of his body, who is in many ways the church, who is Eve in that sense. And the Bible explains from beginning to end this fundamental idea that God is reaching into and meeting with his people, even in the wilderness and in their brokenness. And the second Adam comes into the world, Jesus, to forgive, to restore, and to recommission humans. And when we drill down specifically into the specifics of God's creation of humanity, this is where we see that cultural mandate, where we see that great cultivation. Because in Genesis 1, 27, 28, we see that God's particular act in creating humanity is male and female, and we hear his words spoken directly to them. It says, God blessed them and told the humans to, 1, be fruitful and increase in number, filling the earth, and 2, to rule over all creation and subdue it. That is, to take care of it. This responsibility is the joyful task of doing what God has set in motion, bringing order out of chaos, organizing the diverse aspects of creation, cultivating and developing the good into more good. And I don't know if you've ever sat very closely with Genesis 1 and 2, but it's really amazing to think about it. If I were to ask you, what color was the world when God created Adam? I think from most of the paintings we've seen of this and things, which are great, we often picture Adam being created in the Garden of Eden. But if you read the text closely, we're told that he's actually made in the mud. He's made in the brown, uncultivated part of the world. And then twice we're told that God picks him up and puts him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate it. This fundamental commission to be human is to be commissioned to be cultivating. Genesis 2:15 reads, the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate it and keep it. And he gave Adam and Eve responsibility to do this. And all of this can be described as, again, a cultivating ruling, a wisdom, like a good king and queen. Indeed, one crucial aspect of what it means to be made in God's image is this God enlisting Adam and Eve to serve as his vice regents, to be in his kingdom world, bearing his stamp like ambassadors in the world who are attending to and caring to the king's business. And this royal rule of caring for, developing, expanding the toveness. See, the Garden of Eden is tov, and the humans are meant to expand this toveness into all the brown world, to bring the light that's in the garden, the delight that's in the garden, and spread it to the rest of the world. So to put all this together, God created the world through organizing the chaos, that's the cosmogony, with the result of an increasingly tov place, that's the cosmology of the Bible. And as the crowning work of creation, God created humanity in his image and called them to rule over creation and to continue to develop its toveness. That's what it means to be human. That's the anthropology of the Bible. But humanity rebelled against God, damaging the image of God in humanity, introducing sin into our task. That's the hamartiology. That's what's wrong. But God did not abandon or destroy his creation. Instead, he redeemed it through Christ, restoring the image of God in all who believe, redirecting their rule towards his glory, and promising to one day renew the whole of creation. That's eschatology. So what I've just tried to tell you there is just a very brief version of the story. Some of you are familiar with that, some of you are not. And that's okay. But this is the comprehensive and beautiful vision that the scriptures have for what the world is and who we are in it. So I hope you can see that this is a goat as well, right? The great cultivation, even if it's not familiar to you, is definitely one of the goats. Okay, so now we finally come to the question then that has brought you to this conference probably, and that I began with, and that is, what is the relationship of these three momentous and weighty teachings of Scripture to each other, and then, of course, ultimately to investing? Well, again, rather than seeing them as separate, rather than seeing them as unrelated, rather than seeing them as in some kind of competition with each other, I think these three great moments, the Great Cultivation, the Great Commandment, the Great Commission, they fit together like three sides of a triangle. The point of the Great Commission to go and make disciples of all nations is to create great commandment people who love God and love neighbor, who can then re-engage in this fundamental human calling, the lost great cultivation calling. So do you see? These things are not in competition. This is all what God is doing. He is calling us to make disciples of all nations. And what does a disciple look like? One who grows in loving God and loving neighbor. And as we do that, we can re-engage in the very purpose for why we were made, for which we were made, which is to be involved in the great cultivation. The Great Commission has been so important to Christians for so long, especially in the last few centuries, but it's not an end in itself. Again, the reason Jesus sends his followers into the world is not just to get them saved and get them into the church. Those are fine benefits, but it's to make disciples. And then again, what is a disciple? A disciple is one who is being transformed so that the loves of their life are reordered, that they actually love God and love neighbor above everyone else. And then this, again, leads us to re-engage with our purpose as humans. Now, the reason, friends, I think it matters, the reason it's worth talking about this and putting these together as a triangle is that we need to rediscover this grand biblical triangular truth because all three sides of this triangle matter if we're to faithfully live as Christians and to fulfill the call of God on us individually and corporately. That is, if you and I try to fulfill the great cultivation without the Great Commandment and the Great Commission, so like maybe we're just involved in doing good in the world, we'll merely be engaged in culture making and ecology or something, which are not bad things, but without addressing the God-centeredness and the life transformation that discipleship brings. If you and I try to fulfill the Great Commandment to love God and love neighbor without the great cultivation and without the Great Commission, I think we'll tend towards a generic kind of what used to be called the social gospel of kind of the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man, without the message of Jesus' new life and without a clear ongoing human purpose. Like, what's our purpose? And if you and I try to fulfill the Great Commission without the Great Commandment and without the great cultivation, I think what we'll end up doing, is presenting a truncated message of a kind of heaven-focused, individualistic forgiveness that often devolves into kind of a get-out-of-hell-free card, but with no transformative work of the double love and no clear reason for Christians to be engaged in this world and not just kind of get out of here as soon as we can. And so all of that lays the foundation for the question that is really our goal of our reflections today. How does this impact a Christian view of money and of investing? How does this biblical vision of the three great commandments affect how we Christians should think about our own money, how we should think about markets, how we should think about stewardship and giving, how we think about investing money and investing our clients' money? Now, we know here, and I know that anybody who is here at the Kingdom Advisors Conference and the special select that signed up for this breakfast, the cream of the crop here, we know that you really care about being faithful and wise with money. You wouldn't be here if you didn't care about that for you, yourself and your clients. We also know that you want to work out your Christian faith in terms of how to run your own business. Many of you own your own business, and how you relate to your clients, how you manage wealth. That's all good and beautiful. I think it would be helpful, therefore, to consider how we can see the triangle of these three commandments work its way out in two different contexts that we operate in. First, the context of your own business and how you operate that as a Christian, and then the context of how you invest your money. And we believe that the three great commandments affect all of these. So let's just take them in turn briefly. The Great Commission. As I mentioned, the way many Christians have thought about how to run their wealth management businesses as Christians and how to invest Christianly has often focused primarily, thank you, on the Great Commission. And as we noted, this commandment is very familiar to us. So as the Great Commission has worked its way out, it often looks like this in a kind of business context, that fulfilling the Great Commission by consciously including evangelism and discipleship into our business mindset. And this might mean for you or some of your clients who own businesses, openly sharing your faith at work, maybe running a Bible study, maybe like some people I'm connected with, having a chaplaincy program, something, offering to pray for and with clients. And we have some great examples of that, including people that are very connected, I think, in the Kingdom Advisors world. Jim Wise's idea of client discipleship, that every client, every prospect we meet is somewhere on this spiritual continuum with respect to Jesus. And the question we might ask ourselves in a Great Commission mindset is, how can we help them in every interaction we have with them to move along in their journey? Randy Wilson, Director of Spiritual Integration at Eversource, has a missions background. His job is to create a comprehensive strategy for guiding clients and prospects to Christ. I mean, that's all wonderful. This is a Great Commission mindset working its way out in how you run a business. In terms of investment, well, investment too can be a way for us to live out the Great Commission. When investing is fruitful, then we have the opportunity to give. And one of the good things we can support, and this is in a very common, helpful mindset, is that when we earn money, then we can give to support evangelism, discipleship, missions, etc. For some Christians, the Great Commission has been creatively applied in constantly investing in publicly traded companies that have some sort of Christian presence. Maybe they have a Christian CEO, a Christian chaplain, a Christian employee resource group. The idea is that investing in those businesses is a way to align your money with companies where spiritual conversions and discipleship are possible. This is sometimes called, again, spiritual integration as an investing strategy. If you've heard of, in the faith and work world, something that's called business as mission, where you might go start a business in another country or something, we can think of this similarly as investing as mission. Some also look to invest in what are called kingdom businesses on the frontiers of world missions. So kingdom businesses are often in areas with low gospel penetration, and the businesses are started there with an explicit Christian evangelism mission. We can think of World Vision's Vision Fund, Hope International's Hope Global Investments, and Faith-Driven Investors Marketplace investments like these. And again, we just want to say, this is so good. This is so beautiful, and it honors God, and it's probably familiar to many of you. But we also want to say that this is actually only one side of the triangle. Because if we think of business practices, investment strategies as just for the purpose of evangelism and missions, it can become a kind of ends justify the means ethic, which is not a good idea. And it can, I think, be seen in the popular mantra that has, I think, been in this space that you've been in for many decades. Basically, make as much as you can so you can give as much as you can. That is, give to fund the Great Commission, et cetera. For example, we could think of the great Pastor Rick Warren in Purpose Driven Life. He says there are two kinds of people, kingdom builders and wealth builders. Both are skilled at making businesses grow, making deals or sales and making profit. Wealth builders continue to amass wealth for themselves, no matter how much they make. But kingdom builders change the rules of the game. They still try to make as much as they can, but they do it to give it away. They use the wealth to fund God's church and mission to the world. And so you can see this is that kind of mindset. It's not bad, but you can see it potentially limited, right? That you just make as much as you can so you can give as much away. And the extreme emphasis on giving can cause us to maybe sometimes invest for maximal return without always careful consideration of what we're actually investing in. In our good but fallen world, investing is full of problem areas, and we need to be careful and discerning. And we don't want to invest in bad things just so that we can maximize profit, so that we can give away. I think that's short-sighted. And we can consider, it's possible to consider the only good in the world to be evangelism and missions, and fail to grasp the full goodness of God's world and his work to renew creation itself. So as a result of these errors, what often happens if we only focus on the Great Commission, that our evangelism itself can become thin and really uncompelling, since it's good news that only has to do with like your interior spiritual life and nothing to do with the actual world. And we can end up running businesses and invest like that as well. So what about the Great Commandment? Well, while many Christians continue to focus on the Great Commission, many of you raised your hand to the Great Commandment, there are increasingly moves to pay attention to the Great Commandment and how we run our businesses, that is love for God and love for neighbor, and how we invest. In a business context, when Christians take seriously the Great Commandment and how we run our businesses, the focus is often on personal ethics in our work environment. So, for example, being a person of high integrity and love, consciously seeking to love and serve our employees and our customers, sharing the gospel, yes, when possible, but not only that, truly caring for and serving others regardless of their knowledge or response to the gospel. This is wonderful. And some thoughtful Christians have considered ways that they might think about how love of neighbor works out through all of the neighbors that are part of their business, various stakeholders, clients, vendors, cleaning crews, your landlord. All of these people made in the image of God are ones that God has put into your path, even if you're not just sharing your faith with them, actually just loving them as creatures. And I think a really positive example of this is from Ameriprise's, I don't know if you say CFAN or there's some other way, CFAN, I don't know how they say it, leadership model, right? And their model looks at clients and team and corporate and self and community and suppliers. And they've even discussed how they might love and serve their competitors, contemplating Jesus's command to love even our enemies. So that's all wonderful. When you apply it to the investment context, well, in recent decades, as you may be aware, there has been an increased awareness of how love for God and love for neighbor can create an awareness of the need for ethical approaches to investing. And this is really, I think, in many ways, what has motivated the whole biblically responsible investing movement over the last, many years now. This primarily, at least initially, has looked at negative screening, exclusionary screening, so avoiding companies that dishonor God and harm neighbor. So focusing, of course, often on bad products, abortive drugs, procedures, gambling, casinos, etc., pornography. Randy Alcorn, who's here, of course, has this great, quote along these lines. He says, "God cannot be pleased when we invest his money into companies whose products and services dishonor him and hurt others." You could see the love God, love neighbor in there. It takes time to it's time to take seriously what it means to be biblically responsible investors. We can also see the biblical responsible investing respects a framework to help investors avoid companies that profit from activities that are not honoring God. That's Lauren Graham. Or Dan Hart from the 2023 conference, the motivation behind biblical responsible investing, love God, love neighbor. So there it is. I mean, this has become an increasingly aware part of your world. Later development has begun to focus not just on the negatives, but on the positives, understanding not just to screen things out, but understanding that loving one's neighbor requires more than just not doing harm, but actually doing good to them in that sense. And this positive emphasis, or as positive screening, or sometimes called impact investing, the idea here, many of you are aware of, is to look for companies whose products and or practices are especially praiseworthy or compelling from a Christian perspective. This is what a friend of mine likes to say, that I can't believe it's not charity stories. Like we find some company that is like doing such good with some medical breakthrough or something that we think, I can't believe this isn't charity. We need to invest in this. And that's wonderful. And this can also be applied in the investment process by looking to invest in businesses that are loving all of their stakeholders or neighbors. This is what Eventide's Business 360 approach is wonderful about. I was just talking to somebody yesterday who was mentioning how helpful this was to them. Now, as with the Great Commission focus, this Great Commandment focus can really help us live out our Christian faith in business and investing in really good ways, especially, again, broadening our understanding to include God's love for the whole world and including those who don't even know him. I always think of Jesus' words from Matthew 5:45, that God causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. So we should as well. But while it's good to avoid investing in bad companies, and it's good to look for good companies to invest in, if we just focus on the Great Commandment, it might itself lead us to miss seeing a deeper and wider good in investing, that there is a general good of the material world that God has made. So, for example, we might not see how a waste management company or a materials company or an energy company is actually doing something that honors God and serves the world, even if it's not run by Christians, even if there are no Bible studies there, and even if it's not providing some obvious health breakthrough or charitable service. In other words, there's a God-given business in what my friend Jason Meyer calls boring businesses. That is, that even businesses that aren't exciting, that are aligned with God's purpose for the work, seen through God's eyes, even boring businesses can be wonderful displays of God's glory in creation. This leads us to the final one, and that is the great cultivation. The final part of our triangle is the one that I think that is, and according to the show of hands, probably the least familiar to us in our biblical understanding. And that's why I spent the most time kind of explaining the great cultivation. That is, there is a temptation to think that if we focus our business and investment practices on the Great Commission, the Great Commandment, that our work is done. But I suggest to you, in light of the way the Bible holds all these things together, we're suggesting that we actually need a vision for the cultural mandate or the great cultivation in how you run your business and how you invest. So in the business context, applying this third commandment to how we run our businesses may mean retooling our understanding. We need to see our business itself as a way to engage in our Adam and Eve roles of creating and cultivating God's good creation. And when we do this, we begin to see what I find a very exciting fundamental purpose to business that is beyond, it includes, but it's beyond evangelism and neighbor service. Practiced wisely and well, good financial planning, retirement planning, legacy planning, charitable planning, and wealth management serve not just clients, but actually honor God because we're bringing order out of chaos. A wealth management business is not merely instrumental towards some other good. It's actually part of our calling to use resources wisely, to be like Adam and Eve in the garden, both for client needs and for the development of the world. God is continually at work toward the flourishing of his world, and he's inviting you and me to participate in that same work. And for most of you, your particular calling of financial investing. And this is the vision that drives what we do at a fundamental creational and material level. And I think it can help you understand how you talk to your clients as well about their work as well. We run our businesses for the common good, locally, regionally, nationally, and globally, because that's what God is about. He is about cultivating the world towards flourishing. And applying this then to investment context, beyond maximizing returns so that we can give radically, beyond ethical investing, as good as that is, we'll come to see our investing as an actual participation with God in the work of creation and recreation of the world. You see, God created out of nothing, ex nihilo, but we as his image bearers, his vice regents, his stewards, we get to be involved in uncovering the hidden potential and developing the creation he has made. And amazingly, he invites us to be part of that. We get to be, as Tolkien's famous phrase calls it, sub-creators. God created the world as very good, and in his delight and his generosity, he invites us to make it even better. In this, I always think of the cosmic crisp apple. Think of all the thousands of years of cultivation of apples that have resulted in this cosmic crisp apple. Do you know that one? It's this wonderful apple. That's us being sub-creators with God's creation. That doesn't have anything to do with evangelism necessarily. It doesn't have anything to do with love of neighbor necessarily, as good as those things are. It's just being part of Adam and Eve in the world. So in visual and musical arts, in science and math, in developing building materials and minerals and wood, in understanding chemical reactions, understanding subatomic particles, so that we can make medicines and glues and Velcro and rocket fuel and hypodermic needles. In all these ways, God is inviting us with delight to cultivate, to develop, to expand, to extend the goodness and beauty, the tovness of his creation. And so the focus on the Great Cultivation investing is on how our investing is enlarging the beauty and goodness of the world through the businesses that we're supporting, seeing capital as a God-given gift to continue the cultural mandate. We are called as Christians to take care of the earth and to take care how we develop the earth. And if there's any group of people on earth that should be doing that, it's us. Because we are the ones who are in the line of Adam and Eve through the second Adam. So, to wrap this up, what does this triangular vision look like? Well, here's a great quote to bring it together. If the gospel is to challenge the public life of our society, it will only be by movements that begin with the local congregation, in which the reality of the new creation is present, known, and experienced, and from which men and women will go into every sector of public life as sign, instrument, and foretaste of God's redeeming grace for the whole life of society. So our prayer and hope is that God may use your work in financial advising to be a sign and to be an instrument and to be a foretaste of God's kingdom